Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome Irene, videographer. And I'm going to read you what Donald gave, which is correct, but greatly insufficient. Anyway, our presenter is Donald Rosenbloom. He's an author, editor, and given clinical presentations at regional and national meetings. He will explain why the Middle East is a mess and a danger. That's not all I'm going to say. It's impossible that the anchor man on this 26th lecture relay be anybody but Donald. Because when Donald gives a lecture, you are ipso facto educated. And on this subject, he is an expert, as he is on others. I could go on, but I won't. If you've been here before, you know Donald does a job, and he and Bell are among the mainstays of the History Club. And it's people like that that keep it running. And I'm very glad that Donald is the anchor man. This is the last lecture of this year, this semester. We will be back on November 2nd, and it's probably Howard who will lead us off, but we'll discuss that later. Another mainstay. So, Mickey and I and Cy and the other people who lend meager talents to this organization are very grateful that there are people like Donald around to carry the ball or the baton. And enough with the sports. Donald, you're on.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to give some credit also, one to Lenny Levine and Mickey Baskin for their devotion and effort in running the History Club and making it the successful group it is today. I also have a personal thanks to Professor Art Grossman for his encouragement and his technical assistance. He made this a pleasure and a joy. Also want to thank my wife for her encouragement in and suggestions in putting the presentation together and putting up with all the time it took to make the presentation. I also want to thank our videographer, Irene Soskin, for enabling residents who are unable to attend to get the benefit of this presentation. And last but not least, to our Palm Isle crew, Chris and Sean, I think they left already, for their audiovisual setup and help. And lastly but not least, to you for your vote of confidence. This is my credo. In order to understand the mess we're in today, we have to understand the history that led us up to it. What's in today's news? The ISIS caliphate. We're going to start this presentation with a caliphate, and we're going to end it with a caliphate. The Shia-Sunni civil wars and failed states. This last week was the anniversary of the Armenian genocide. It was also the anniversary of the Gallipoli campaign, the Israel-Palestine two-state solution, and right now there's sophisticated weaponry coming into the Middle East, not only atomic, but helicopters and fighter planes, and what danger this poses.
That's enough for 2 terms.
The topic is why the Middle East looks the way it does and why it is a mess. We're going to talk about triumph and defeat, betrayal, deception, double dealing, and hypocrisy.
Anything good?
The British deceived the Arabs, the French, the United States, and the Jews. The French deceived the Arabs, the British, and the United States. Didn't work on the Jews till later. Hypocrisy. They try to make the world safe for democracy and self-determination, and instead they dealt with Arabs who advocate Sharia law. And after they were there, they brutally repressed revolts. And then is the double standard for the state of Israel. These are the groups that are in the Middle East. At the time of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans and the Turks left them alone. They paid taxes. They took care of their own cultural needs. They're Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Muslims, Druze, Christians, and Jews. This is what the Middle East looked before the start of the First World War. To give you just an overall picture first, the World War I was a miscalculation and misjudgment catastrophe. All wars basically are based on religion and economics. The Allies, the Christian powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, had millions of Muslim subjects. You can see the areas that they controlled: British, the French, the Italian, Spanish, and the Russians. And the Ottoman Empire is in green. The Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, took a gamble. They urged the Caliph, the first Caliph at the time, the Turkish Sultan Mehmed V of the Ottoman Empire, to proclaim an Islamic holy war so that they would defect to the Central Powers. The Ottomans, on the other hand, feared the influence of the Russian Christians, especially Greek and Armenian, who formed a substantial and economically important minority in their heartland. They miscalculated badly. With the help of T.E. Lawrence and the governor, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, they used dynastic rivalries in a successful Muslim revolt, Arab revolt basically, against the Turks in Mesopotamia. Ethnicity and nationalism, Arab nationalism, trumped religious bonds, even where religion was zealous. Today it's being reversed. Competing versions of Islam are tearing down the borders drawn 100 years ago. Syria and Iraq have ceased to exist as states. The leader of ISIS, the Islamic State, has proclaimed himself the new caliph and vowed to erase the shame of the Sykes-Picot conspiracy. They even blew up the border checkpoints between Syria and Iraq. People claimed all they learned about the Middle East they got from watching the movie Lawrence of Arabia. These are the key players in today's story. Lawrence of Arabia, Sharif Hussein ibn Ali, and his sons. He was the guardian of Mecca, the holiest place in the Muslim world. Orda Abu Tayyib, Winston Churchill, Sykes and Picot, Chaim Weizmann, who you know, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And they seem random, but they fit like a jigsaw puzzle. Lawrence, Hussein, and Orda are the ones who are responsible for defeating the Turks. Winston Churchill and Mustafa Ataturk are connected too. Churchill is responsible for him becoming a hero and the president of Turkey. I showed you before that there were triumphs and defeats. The triumph was the defeat of the Turks in the Middle East. The defeat was the Battle of the Dardanelles at Gallipoli. It was a disaster, but it made Ataturk a hero. and Turkey was a key player, unfortunately, is being sidelined in the Middle East. Lawrence also arranged for a secret meeting between Chaim Weizmann and Hussein's son Faisal. Sykes also helped Weizmann lobby for the Balfour Declaration. Now back to Lawrence of Arabia. It was a great movie. A lot of very famous actors are in it. Let's see if we can separate fact from Hollywood. Peter O'Toole was tall, lanky, and blonde. The real Lawrence was 5'5", but he knew Mesopotamia. Having traveled and worked in archaeological digs for the British Museum, he spoke colloquial Arabic and did a PhD thesis on Crusader castles. At the outbreak of World War I, he joined the British Army Intelligence and was posted in Cairo. He developed respect and romantic affinity for the Arabs. He developed a friendship and alliance with Sharif Hussein and Abin Ali, who claimed to be Hussein claimed to be a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and his sons. In return for the support of the British, Hussein would be guaranteed an independent Arab nation encompassing the entire Middle East. Sir Henry McMahon, the top British diplomat, agreed, even though he knew of their strict religious beliefs. The Turks were liberal, and that the British government had no intention of granting independence. Late in the film, there's a famous scene where Claude Rains, who plays a British official, incidentally, Claude Rains was my favorite actor, and many years later, I had the opportunity to work on him as a patient. He played the British official who brought the bad news of the secret Sykes-Picot agreement drawn up supposedly by minor civil servants. They were not minor, they were major. And Lawrence was not surprised. He knew all about the skullduggery. He was a neo-colonialist himself. However, it did actually reflect the anger of the Arab leaders, played by Omar Sharif and Anthony Quinn, when they first learned of the betrayal of the British. At the end of the film, O'Toole leaves Damascus despondent and disillusioned. That's not true. In real life, he immediately plunged into imperialistic politics. I forgot to tell you, he became undersecretary to Winston Churchill. And he helped set up the borders of Iraq and brokered the secret meeting between Weizmann and Faisal. That's in a movie. That's in real life. This is Faisal, who was to become the next caliph. He became the king. Now this man, played by Anthony Quinn, was in a picture, again, there's fact in Hollywood. He was portrayed as a boorish, greedy, and loyal to his own tribe. He stole loot. The real order was an intellectual, a fierce supporter of the Arab cause, and he was a military genius. He developed a technique of battle that is being used in modern times, and to the detriment of American troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam. That strategy is guerrilla warfare. Now, Churchill, just a few more words about him. We all know he was a colonialist and he was a proponent of expanding the British Empire. And the main way of doing that was with the British Navy. He was First Lord of the Admiralty. He favored development of airplanes at that time in battle, and he wanted to convert the Navy from coal to oil. It was more efficient, lighter weight, and gave a greater speed advantage. There was only one problem. There's no oil in Great Britain. And at the time, the world's largest producer of petroleum was the United States. But even he didn't want to depend on an ally. And he didn't want to pay fair market price. So he had to guarantee the strategic control of oil supplies on favorable terms to them and deny it to his enemies. Now, sight, we discussed the original. I was going to do a presentation like this years ago and called it Lines in the Sand. He drew a line in the sand. He arbitrarily said, I want to draw a line from A at Accra to K in Kirkuk. Everything above that is British, everything below that is French. What he ended up getting is oil. You can see before that there was the French had control in that area, the British were there before. This just added to their areas of control. He also got Palestine and Jordan. They also got it. Now, the key to what's going on today is the Shia-Sunni divide. The story of Islam's division between Sunni and Shia started with the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632. There was a power struggle over who would succeed him in ruling the Islamic Caliphate. Most Muslims wanted to elect the next leader, but some argued that power should go by divine birthright to Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali. The pro-Ali faction, known as the Partisans of Ali, or Shi'atu Ali in Arabic, shortened to Shia. His eventual ascension to the throne sparked a civil war, which they lost. But the Shia still hold on to the idea that he was the rightful successor, and they became a separate branch of Islam. About 10 to 15% of Muslims worldwide are Shia. They're a majority in Iran and Iraq only, while most Muslims are Sunni. Sunni roughly means tradition. Today that division is again a political one. It's a struggle for regional influence between Shia political powers led by Iran versus Sunni political powers led by Saudi Arabia. I'm going to ask a question later on, who do we have to be afraid of more? And the struggle is like a regional Cold War with proxy battles now going on Syria, Yemen. This is a picture of basically the modern Middle East before the Arab Spring. And you can see the part that oil plays. The Middle East produces a third of the world's oil and a tenth of its natural gas. The energy producers are heavily clustered in three neighboring countries that have historically hated one another: Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. The United States has been deeply involved for years. At first, it sided against Iran during the Iran-Iraq War in 1980, then against Iraq when it invaded Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia in the 1990s, again against Iraq with the 2003 invasion, and now supporting Saudi Arabia in its rapidly worsening proxy war against Iran. Treaty of Versailles, a disaster. These are the big four. One of them is Woodrow Wilson. Let's not think of him as an angel either. There were other vultures waiting besides the British and the French to take advantage of the Ottoman Empire. One was Russia. Their plans were sidetracked by the Russian Revolution. The American plans were sidetracked for the same reason, for the same problems that are going on today between Obama and Congress. When Wilson went back, the isolationists, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, refused any overseas intervention. They wouldn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and they didn't want any involvement at all. Instead of that, they went to South America, Latin America, they set up banana republics. Actually, Iraq and Iran were banana republics in Europe. The only thing they did accomplish is having their influence with oil companies. Now, one of the other things they did, I mentioned the Dardanelles invasion. They wanted revenge against the Turks, and they took away a lot of their property, a lot of their land. And they drew up the Treaty of Sevres in 1920. Ataturk really blew his top. He was a hero at the time. Everybody loved him. He started a revolution. He took away the citizenship of the delegation that signed the treaty, went to war, took back the territory, thumbed his nose at the four powers, and they had him draw up a new treaty. That's Ataturk. Had him draw up a new treaty, which is how Turkey looks today. Now, Turkey was a big supporter of the United States. We had missiles there aimed at Russia. A big supporter of the State of Israel. Unfortunately, the Islamists have taken over, and the picture has changed. Now, Iran was not involved in the war directly. However, if Russia had not gone out, they would have suffered more. But even before the First World War, they lost property to Russia, and the country was divided into two spheres, the Russian sphere and the British sphere, and they ran the show, and they resented it. They also resented our intervention in their politics with the CIA assassination of Mossadegh. Now, let's get to our friend Chaim Weizmann. When I was young, I was brought up with the concept, why the Balfour Declaration? And the answer at that time was that he was a chemist. He had the lair of the British Admiralty. He was there from 1917 to 1919, and he helped the war effort. He developed synthetic acetone, among other things. And he said, that was his payoff. He also was friendly with Arthur Balfour, who was his representative in Manchester. But there's more to it than that. The British hoped that supporting Zionism would get them support for American Jews who would help Woodrow Wilson join the war. They also wanted to establish a pro-British settler colony as a buffer against the French. It was really a geopolitical move. And the other thing that I really was surprised to learn, in this country, who are the biggest supporters of the State of Israel? the Christian evangelicals. It turns out that Arthur Balfour and the future Prime Minister David Lloyd George were some of the first Christian Zionists. Now, in case you don't know what it is, the Christian Zionists believe the Jews returning to the biblical land of Israel will precede the second coming of Christ. They support populating Palestine with Jewish settlers to hasten that process. However, if the Jews and other religious groups don't convert to Christianity, they will perish in the fires of hell. The Zionist leaders embrace their allies despite the blatant anti-Jewish theology that requires Jews to give up their faith. Off the record, we have some very dear Zionist friends, and they confess to me, if Jesus comes back, they'll convert. Now there was a two-state solution. As I told you, Lawrence arranged a secret meeting between Weitzman and Feisel. At that time, Feisel was, money talks, Feisel was on the British payroll at that time for £150,000 a month. That's a lot of money. On January 3rd, 1919, Feisel and Weizmann agreed on a border that would create Jewish and Arab countries. They agreed to establish a Zionist-controlled state in Palestine, leaving the rest to the Hashemite monarchs. The Zionists were to get land and peace. Sounds familiar? The monarchs got a vastly larger territory and promises of Zionist help with economic development. That agreement was dead letter within days of its signing. And the reason for that is the British had no intention of giving the Arabs a state or giving the Jews a state. But the principle is still there. Now, in all fairness, Sari Tartaglia is going to give you a presentation in January, I believe. He'll cover a lot of the efforts leading up to the mandate. I'm just going to cover the border areas. And from what I hear in talking to him, it's going to be a treat. Three maps shows the original partition, the Zionists accepted it, the Arabs didn't. All countries, all the Arab countries invaded Israel. The green shows you how much territory they conquered. The yellow is what was left for the Israelis. The third map shows you the Israeli counterattack, and the green was what was left for the Arabs. That was the state of Israel before 1967. This is Israel after the 67 war. On this line, Jordanian control, Egyptian control of Gaza. After the 67 war, Israel had the Sinai Desert, which had returned to Egypt. And Gaza, when they were trying to, phase out, and they had a free election, Hamas took over, and they're on their own. The West Bank is still contentious. And the settlements, that's a story in itself. Now, they drew lines in the sand. There's always been a concept of redrawing those lines along ethnic and cultural lines. If that were true, it would look something like this. The Sunni state, Shia state, Kurdish state. There'd be a separate Alawite state, which is a separate division of the Shia. Then there's Lebanon and Israel. But that's how the Shia-Sunni divide would look, hypothetically. Actually, it's pretty much on the ground that way today. We hear about the Kurds. And Kurdistan. The Kurds are an ethnic group who long lived as a disadvantaged minority and have been fighting for a nation for a long, long time. This is where the national borders have been proposed on many occasions. They fought armed rebellions in Syria and Turkey, suffered abuses, genocide, bans on language and culture. The major victory they had was a result of the U.S.-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein. The Iraqi Kurds had their own government. One thing that the Kurds have is oil. We go back and on the current caliphate, ISIS. This is what the caliphate looks like today. Syria, Iraq. And they're extending themselves elsewhere. They even had put the flag up in Yemen this morning. Basically, the current conflicts can be traced back after World War I, who divided the country in what had been the Ottoman Empire. They paid little attention to ancient tribal, ethnic, and religious differences. The result was the creation of neighboring countries that have not become nations. In 1919, there was no Iraqi people. History, religion, geography pulled the people apart. The Shiite and Sunni sects of Islam had split centuries earlier. In creating the new nation of Iraq in ancient Mesopotamia, Britain cobbled together the Ottoman provinces of Baghdad, which was mostly Sunni, Basra, mostly Shiite, and Mosul, mostly Kurdish. What kept Iraq together for more than 80 years was the autocratic rule of kings and dictators. In 1921, the British installed as a king Faisal, the son of the ruler of Mecca. The monarchy was overthrown in 1958. There were military coups, and then the Ba'ath Party seized control in 1968, brought to power Saddam Hussein, who was toppled by the U.S. coalition in 2003. Without a strong man, sectarian violence has brought civil war, and ISIS derives its strength from the mistreatment of the Sunni majority by the ruling Shia majority through Maliki. Another factor that brings the Taliban, Hamas, and extremist groups to the front is one of the most prevalent enterprises in the Middle East, and that's corruption. And these Islamists promise a rule of law, which they have, Sharia law, and they give them social services. So they pay for it by not supporting the dictators. I want to close with a quote. I started with a quote, and I want to close with a quote by two very smart men. And this was from an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal a week ago. History will not do all work for us. It only helps those who seek to help themselves. So we have to learn from what went before to prevent disasters from happening again. I thank you for coming and listening, and if you have any questions or discussion, now there's one point I raised before. Who should we be more afraid of? Iran or Saudi Arabia? Anybody have any ideas?
Saudi. Oh. I'd say Saudi Arabia.
Actually, no one there is our friends, but the Saudis are the ones who bankrolled ISIS. They're the ones who gave them the philosophy. They're the ones who visited us on 9/11. I think there may be more, I hate to say it, I think there's more hope with Iran than there is with, so that's my point of view. The other is, we're talking about hypocrisy. There was an item in the paper about a week ago that distressed me. And the subject isn't what distressed me. The subject was humanitarian disaster. Where was this humanitarian disaster? Outside of Baghdad, in a camp, Yarmouk, Palestinian refugee camp. 67 years after the partition of Palestine. Why are they there? Now, there are refugees coming across to Italy. Humanitarian disaster. What are they doing? They're resettling them. Why are these settlers there? Who's supporting them? The United Nations. They're keeping them there as a fostering ulcer. Anybody have any opinions?
Yes, it's true.
Further hypocrisy, Zionism is racism, I mean, if you want to talk about hypocrisy. Now the other thing is that even these countries didn't even get their freedom easily either. After they established the mandate, there were rebellions. The rebellions were put down brutally. Who were the ones who were the worst? The French. We remember during the Second World War, the German invasion of Poland. They bombed civilians in Warsaw. They came in with mechanized vehicles. Who was the first country to use it? France. In Damascus. They brutally suppressed the rebellion. Even after the Second World War, they didn't want to give up. But they couldn't afford it anymore, and public opinion at that time forced them to leave. Any more comments? Someone's got a young lady.
Thank you. Let's put you in charge. What would you do?
There's no answer. There's no answer.
What was the question?
If I was in charge, what would I do? There's no one to deal with. It's going to take several generations of education to appreciate. Going to Palestine. At one time I had hopes because the Israelis are a technologically advanced country. They have so much to offer, and they could all benefit from it. But instead of that, they have their hatred, which is the textbooks promulgate. So it has to take a few generations to do it. That's my hope. Gentleman in the back.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The Balfour Declaration, when it was presented, gave the Jews land from the Mediterranean all the way into what is now Jordan.
Right.
A huge amount of land.
Right.
Then the League of Nations decided to screw the Jews, and they took away all the land and created Transjordan or Jordan.
Right.
And then in 1947, the United Nations wanted to screw the Jews, so they took away the so-called West Bank, Judea, Samaria, and gave Israel that little slit of land.
They could never survive. They could never survive in that
Right.
original land.
And after from 1948 to 1967, the so-called West Bank was controlled by the King of Jordan,
Right,
the dictator of Jordan. He did nothing. There were no Palestinians.
right.
Never heard of a Palestinian.
You're 100%
As soon as the
correct.
Jews won the '67 war, all of a sudden, out of the caves and out of there came Palestinians. And I think Mickey resents the word occupied. There is no occupy. The big mistake Israel made, they should have annexed the West Bank, and
Right.
then it became part of Israel.
Let's go
That's
back.
what I call them.
Okay, Jim, wait,
You
wait.
said, what am I saying?
I agree with you.
Okay,
Well, use the word.
okay, wait.
Conquerors.
They conquered
Okay. To answer,
Jewish blood in Judea and Samaria.
you asked the question, what I would do. There's a word which has a lot of different meanings to people. That word is resettlement, okay? I mentioned the Armenian genocide. The Turks called it resettlement. They moved them out. They had resettlement when they had the division of India into Pakistan and India. They had resettlement after the Second World War. The Russians moved the Germans and the Poles. I get friends, my solution in Palestine is resettlement. Let the United Nations pay for it.
May I add one thing?
You can, you're okay.
Right now, this country and this administration wants Israel to survive on 1/4 of the land that they were given in the Balfour Declaration. 25%.
Next election.
You can read it.
Isn't it helps those who help themselves vote the next election? That's it? Oh, no, man,
Yeah,
Bob.
how come Egypt and Jordan don't get involved in this act? That they seem to be much more stable than the Syrians, the Lebanese situation, and so forth.
Because we have influence there.
Ah,
And we pay.
really?
Yeah. Just payola. They're really banana republics.
Any more questions? Howard?
I think you left out one of the most important things, since you picked a subject that's so enormous.
You can't cover everything.
Complete it in one semester. One of the things that helped Israel become Israel was Israel was going to be defeated in the United Nations in 1948.
I think that Cy is going to cover it. Cy, you're going to cover that? He's going to cover that part there.
I'm not Cy, I'm Howard.
But I don't want to take away his territory.
I'm not
Yeah.
taking away his territory. I'm telling you something that's coordinated with this. If Cy wants to get up and tell about it, by all means, he can do it.
January.
January. You want to wait till January?
Yes.
Go ahead.
In 1948, Israel was defeated. There weren't enough nations to welcome them into the League of Nations, into their own country. And all of a sudden, it was revealed by Harry Truman and other people that Nelson Rockefeller owned these countries in South America, which were the countries in the UN who were vacillating whether who to vote for. So Chaim Weizmann, through his sources, which is another word for his secret spies, found that Nelson Rockefeller was assisting the Nazis in World War II with oil. Hello? You know what that means? That if Nelson Rockefeller was revealed, he would be a traitor and he would have to be in prison for many, many years, if not hung. So Chaim Weizmann, with another group, went to see Nelson Rockefeller at the UN on 42nd Street, and they discussed this with him. And so he says to them, you want to prosecute me? You want justice or a country? And what do you think Weizmann said? Country. I want a country. So Nelson Rockefeller got on the horn, got in touch with these countries who he controlled in South America, and they all turned their vote around and voted for Israel in the UN. And that's how Israel became a nation.
Good story.
Okay.
Thanks, that's a good story.
True story.
Anybody else have anything to ask or comment on? Well, I will tell you that Donald did a great deal of work here,
Yes, yes.
and if you paid attention, you were educated. And personally, I am very grateful for that effort, and I want you to know how successful it really
I
was.
appreciate that.
One of the things you gotta explain when you first said,
Bell, you want to say
use the
something?
word caliphate. I wonder how many people here know what a caliphate is. You wouldn't explain it.
We all know what a caliphate is. You don't give it enough credit, Howard. Caliphate is the new country that ISIS is trying to create.
From the old country,
Yes.
which extended
Okay.
from
Now then.
Italy all the way to Spain.
I want to also tell you that this being the last class of the season, the next class is November 2nd.